Audaciously Disobedient presents Line of Resolve. In the year 2047, the nation of Corvina teetered under the iron grip of an authoritarian regime, the Democratic Liberal Progressive Party, DLPP. Having risen to power through promises of equity and sustainability, the DLPP had slowly dismantled the rights of the populace under the guise of progress. The Corvina government had mandatory neural chips for all government employees. However, they struggled to force their will on the people that worked in the private sector. Surveillance infiltrated every corner of life, personal property was heavily taxed or seized, and dissent was silenced. But the final blow came with the Civilian Disarmament Act, a sweeping mandate requiring all privately owned firearms to be surrendered. It was heralded as a measure to ensure public safety, but the people of Corvina saw it for what it was, the complete erasure of their ability to resist tyranny. Among those who refused compliance was Ethan Harper, a farmer and father of 3 in the rural town of Redwood, Glen. Ethan had no military background, no formal leadership training, just an unshakable resolve to defend his family and his community. Redwood Glen wasn't just his home. It was a close-knit community of hunters, tradesmen, and freedom-loving individuals who shared his conviction. The people of Redwood Glen and neighboring towns had seen the writing on the walls for years. They made strategic purchases and connections in preparation. The people had almost completely stopped using the Corvina currency, choosing instead to conduct most of their business in a combination of cryptocurrencies and precious metals. They were still forced to convert some of their wealth to government currency to pay the high property taxes. The call to arms. The DLPP agents had left Redwood Glen that afternoon, their black SUVs kicking up dust as they disappeared down the dirt road that led out of town. The silence they left behind was heavy, oppressive. The ultimatum they delivered rang in every resident's ears: 3 days to surrender your firearms, or we will return to enforce compliance. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the town, Ethan Harper knew there wasn't a moment to waste. He climbed the creaking steps of the town's old church, pushing open the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of varnish. Rows of pews stretched before him, and the modest altar stood bathed in the soft, golden glow of the setting sun filtering through the stained glass windows. Ethan rang the church bell. Its deep, resonant tone echoed across the town, calling everyone to gather. Families emerged from their homes, leaving behind unfinished dinners and chores, drawn by the urgency they saw in Ethan's face as he stood in the doorway, waving them inside. The meeting. The pews filed in quickly, and soon the church was packed with farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, mechanics, and their families. The murmur of anxious voices filled the space until Ethan stepped up to the pulpit. He looked out at the crowd, faces he'd known his whole life, faces that carried the weight of uncertainty and fear. He took a deep breath and began. "They'll be back in 3 days, he said. His voice was calm but carried an edge of steel. "And when they come, they won't be asking. They'll be taking." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. "They want our guns, but it's not just about that," Ethan continued. "It's about control. If we give in, we give up more than our firearms. We give up our freedom. And if we do that, what's next? Our homes? Our children?" The room fell silent. Ethan let the words sink in before pressing on. "I'm not a soldier," he said, his voice softer now. "I've never fought a war, but I know this: no one is coming to save us. If we want to protect our families, our town, and everything we've built, we have to do it ourselves. And we have to start now. It is about freedom, and that belongs to all of us." The first volunteers. For a moment, no one moved. The enormity of the situation hung in the air like a weight. Then, a man stood up. It was Harold Rosso, the town's blacksmith, welder and machinist, his broad shoulders and weathered hands a testament to a lifetime of hard work. "I'll stand with you, Ethan," Harold said. Another voice chimed in from the back. It was Rachel Carter, the former IT specialist turned homesteader. "Me too," she said firmly. "And I'll bring what I know. If they want to use their tech against us, we'll use it against them." One by one, others rose. Joseph, the owner of the general store, pledged his support. Claire, a schoolteacher, volunteered to help organize supplies. Even teenagers like Mark, Ethan's eldest son, stepped forward, their faces resolute. Ethan raised his hand to quiet the room. He calmly proclaimed, "This will be a war. We must let them make the first move, and once they do, we must be ready to not just defend the town, but to go on the offensive." Everyone present nodded in agreement, knowing the little bit of freedom they had left and the freedom of all future generations was at stake. Once the war goes hot, We must act swiftly to ensure victory as quickly as possible. The DLPP will simply continue to escalate until our entire town is a crater, Ethan said, knowing there would be no going back once they made their first stand. There was a few seconds of silence that felt like hours as everyone came to grips with the situation they had seen coming for years. Harold broke the silence. I guess we should get to work. The people went to their respective homes and businesses to have some serious discussions and begin preparations. A town transformed. The next morning, the town was unrecognizable. Redwood Glen had become a hive of activity, its people united in purpose. Ethan and Harold led the effort to organize the town's weapons. Rifles, shotguns, pistols, and ammunition were gathered and sorted. Families who didn't own firearms were paired with those who had spares. Ethan assigned a small team to scout the outskirts of town, identifying defensible positions and weak points. They built barricades from felled trees, abandoned cars, and sandbags. The blacksmith's forge roared to life as Harold tasked his apprentices with crafting makeshift armor, blades, and reinforcements for the barricades. The DLPP was known for its technological superiority, deploying drones, surveillance systems, and advanced communication networks. Recognizing this, Rachel Carter, the IT specialist, teamed up with Samuel Greaves, a robotics engineer that mostly worked in the agricultural industry. Together, they led the town's tech team in crafting a counter-strategy. Ethan knew the situation was about to escalate. More preparations must be made, he thought to himself. Ethan spoke to Rachel and Samuel. They knew the DLPP would use their air superiority and technology to jam their communications during battle. They needed a reliable system. The first issue was the control of the airspace. Local aviation enthusiast, Victor Alvarez, had a fleet of two-seater sub-Sonox jet aircraft stationed at his private airport. He used them for fertilizing farm fields and giving tourists an adrenaline rush. These aircraft would be able to access the high altitude that DLPP surveillance drones often operated at. Ethan had a good relationship with Victor, having sold him unpasteurized milk from his goats for the past couple years. Ethan went to visit Victor, who was in the main hangar. Victor was notified of Ethan's arrival by his security system and was already making him a cup of coffee. Victor knew why Ethan was there, and gestured to a pile of transponders on the floor as he passed Ethan the cup of hot coffee. He had been removing them from all aircraft since he heard the news about the DLPP's plan to confiscate firearms. The weather is calling for rain all night. It will provide perfect cover from the surveillance drones, Victor said. Ethan nodded and replied, I have already cleared my heavy equipment garage to make space. Ethan took the coffee back to his truck and backed the trailer up, right into the hangar. Together they loaded 2 planes on the trailer without saying a word. Nothing needed to be said. They had planned this in theory years ago. Before driving off, Ethan said to Victor, Jack and the guys will be by later with more trucks to move the rest of the planes. Jack Marston was a farmer from the nearby town of Birch Hollow. Victor nodded. Yeah, I was talking to him last night. My family has already relocated to Birch Hollow, he replied. With a final nod, Ethan drove off, towing 2 aircraft. They both knew the DLPP would target Victor's house once the planes were being used in operations. When Ethan got back to Redwood Glen, Harold and some of the employees of his welding shop met Ethan at his garage. Ethan put forward his thoughts. First, we need to get rid of all rounded panels in favor of flat panels. When radar hits a rounded surface, it reflects the signal in all directions. When it hits a flat panel, the reflection is linear, infinitely reducing the chances of being detected by radar. Harold's employees immediately started taking all the panels off of one of the planes. Then they took a 3D scan of the shell and designed their new stealth aircraft in a CAD software. They put that CAD design in a flight simulator, made some adjustments to improve the design, leaving room for rifles to be mounted underneath the panels, of course. The top speed and amount of lift generated would both be reduced, but it would still fly. They began 3D printing graphite panels to place on the shell of the stripped aircraft to match the design. The next issue was communication. Rachel reminded Ethan about an old technology called a field telephone that could be operated over great distances with just a thin wire connecting the device. They had plenty of speaker wire and decided to send out teams in all directions to houses outside of town, near access roads, to create observation posts and stage some fire teams. Once the DLPP initiated contact, the teams in the observation posts would already be in a position to flank the attack. Rachel, Samuel and their tech team set up a command center in the basement of the general store. The team crafted homemade signal jammers to disrupt the DLPP's drones and surveillance equipment. The team repurposed off-the-shelf drones, equipping them with thermal cameras and explosives crafted from fertilizer and scrap metal. Using a tether, the drone would remain hardwired to the user until it had acquired its target via the thermal camera. Then the drone would drop the tether and be internally guided to the target, where a proximity sensor would trigger the onboard explosive. This internal guidance system would be immune to jamming and the tether would allow the operator to remain behind cover. Using heavy equipment and some extra cable the town's electrician had in inventory, massive coils of wire were installed under the dirt road at choke points. Using repurposed transformers connected to the town's independent electric grid to the coils of wire. When fired they would generate massive electromagnetic pulses or EMPs directly under the DLPP's overly digital vehicles. Rachel's team hacked into DLPP communication channels, gathering intel on their movements. Using radio scanners and encrypted devices, Rachel planned to stay one step ahead of the enemy. Every magazine that had been pinned to restrict capacity, as required by the government's law, had the pins removed. This allowed the magazine to hold the standard amount of ammunition. The pins were collected and added to the shrapnel being used in the homemade explosives. Firearms training. In the fields outside town, Ethan held a training session for anyone willing to learn. "Listen up," he called, standing in front of a line of townsfolk holding rifles, shotguns, and pistols. "This isn't about being the best shot in the world. It's about being reliable. You need to trust yourself and your weapon." He demonstrated the basics: proper stance, how to grip a firearm, and how to aim. "Control your breathing," he instructed. "Squeeze the trigger, don't yank it. Let the shot surprise you." Harold, who had experience with hunting, taught others how to handle shotguns effectively. "These are your best friends in close quarters," he said, holding up his own 12-gauge. "Point, shoot, and move. Don't waste time aiming for perfection." The town's armory was a patchwork of firearms, bolt-action hunting rifles, AR-15s, shotguns, pistol-caliber carbines and handguns of all kinds. Volunteers were assigned to train their neighbors on the use of unfamiliar weapons. People swapped knowledge, sharing techniques for cleaning, loading, and maintaining firearms. Ethan knew that while many in the town were familiar with firearms, few had ever been trained for coordinated combat. Using his own experience as an avid hunter and firearms enthusiast, he devised a crash course to prepare the townsfolk for what was coming. With the help of younger residents who had experience with airsoft and paintball, they practiced squad-based maneuvers. Residents learned how to move in small groups, use cover effectively, and communicate silently with hand signals. Ethan assigned roles based on individual skills. Those who were accurate shooters became designated marksmen. Stronger individuals were taught how to use shotguns for close-quarters defense, while others focused on pistols and pistol-caliber carbines for fast, mobile operations. Knowing a battle could last for days, and the fact that they were about to enter a war, Ethan insisted on nighttime drills. Using flashlights, night vision equipment, and even improvised torches, the people learned to navigate and fight in low light conditions. Unity and purpose. As the sun set on the second day, the townsfolk gathered again at the church. This time, there was no fear, only determination. Ethan stood at the pulpit once more, looking out at the people. "We've done something incredible," he said. "We've come together, we've prepared. And tomorrow, when they come back, they won't find a town that's afraid. They'll find a town that's ready to make a stand." The people cheered, feeling confident in the preparations they had made. The calm before the storm. That night, the town was eerily quiet. Ethan sat on his porch with his wife, Sarah, watching the stars. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know we can't just roll over and let them take everything. We have to stand for something." As dawn broke over Redwood Glen, the town stood ready. Farmers, teachers, blacksmiths, and teenagers stood side by side, armed and resolute. They weren't soldiers, but they were something far more powerful, a united community with something worth fighting for. And when the DLPP returned that morning, they would learn that the people of Redwood Glen weren't just protecting their guns, they were protecting their freedom, their families, and their future. The First Skirmish. DLPP returned, not in black SUVs, but in troop carriers. Redwood Glen was ready. They would not be intimidated into submission. Ethan stood alone at the entrance of town. He was wearing a hunter's orange hat and vest, holding a single-shot, break-open, wooden stock .22 long rifle that had been in his family for generations. The action was open to show the agents it was not loaded. The troop carriers stopped just short of where Ethan was standing. One agent got out of the front seat and approached Ethan. The agent grabbed the firearm to try and take it. Ethan held firm. The agent stepped back, pepper-sprayed Ethan, and then tried to take the firearm again. Troops disembarked from the carriers and formed a line in front of the trucks. Ethan did not move and did not let go of the family heirloom. The agent stepped back again. This time he took out a taser and discharged it on Ethan. Ethan fell to the ground. Then, miraculously, still holding the gun his father had given him, he stood back up. The agent said, "Fine, Let us make an example out of you as he pulled out his pistol and shot Ethan in the head. Almost immediately the agent was struck with a hail of gunfire from 10 different well-fortified locations. Explosive drones were airborne and on their way to the DLPP troop carriers. Exploding with tremendous force, the line of troops was broken by the explosions and subsequent gunfire from the people of Redwood Glen. The DLPP underestimated the resistance. Redwood Glen had sent a clear message: their resolve was absolute and they would not be disarmed. Ethan's son, Mark, raced up to where Ethan's body lay. Harold was right behind him, keeping a close eye on the now burning troops carriers. As the people of Redwood Glen secured the area, they were able to take 4 prisoners, 15 working rifles and 7 rifles that could be used for parts to make 3 working rifles. The people of the town gathered near the church. All knew they had just started a war. They had to act quickly, knowing DLPP would retaliate quickly. Rachel spoke up, "No time to waste, you know where I will be," as she headed toward her workshop. Rachel's team hijacked government propaganda broadcasts, replacing them with footage of the recent events, along with a message showing others that despite their technology, the DLPP was not invincible. The prisoners they had taken were all paralyzed, within 30 minutes. The DLPP must have done this using their neural chips. They don't want our prisoners to talk or be able to hear our side. Rachel theorized aloud. Harold responded, "Can we do anything?" "Maybe," replied Rachel. She went to her workshop and came back moments later. She had made a handheld EMP out of 3 AA batteries, a capacitor from an old camera's flash and a coil of wire. She held the coil of wire up to one of the prisoner's neural chips and fired the EMP. Their prisoner woke up. Rachel woke all the prisoners and had them locked in a root cellar. The people of Redwood Glen didn't pay much attention to the prisoners, but they did feed them. The prisoners could not understand what the food was seasoned with or why it tasted so good. The food was not seasoned with anything. Naturally grown livestock, fruit and vegetables was not something that was available at grocery stores in Corvina. The Siege of Redwood Glen. Harold and Mark stood on the church's bell tower, scanning the horizon with binoculars. They knew the DLPP would be back soon. Beside him, Rachel Carter held a field telephone. Below, the town bustled with activity. Men and women arming themselves, securing positions, and checking their gear. "They're coming," a voice spoke over the field telephone. It was one of the observation posts stationed at a house on the outskirt of town. 4 tanks and 5 armored troop transports to start, more in the distance. Through the lenses, Harold could see the unmistakable headlights of an approaching convoy rolling slowly down the main road, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. Rachel nodded. "It's time," she announced loudly. Harold, Mark and Rachel descended the tower and walked to the center of the town square. Farmers, hunters, mechanics, and shopkeepers turned fighters stood ready. "They think they can crush us tonight," Harold began, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "They've brought their tanks, their troops, their drones, but they've underestimated us. They don't know our land, our resolve, or our strength. Tonight, we show them that freedom isn't something they can take from us." A cheer rose from the crowd, and they dispersed to their positions. The DLPP's advance. The DLPP forces halted just outside the town's perimeter. Soldiers disembarked, spreading into formation as their drones began to buzz overhead. Rachel's tech team immediately activated the jamming equipment. Many of the drones faltered mid-air, crashing into trees and rooftops, while others lost their video feed and circled aimlessly. The first shots were fired by the hidden marksmen. Silent and precise, they took out key targets, drone operators, squad leaders, and heavy weapon specialists. The DLPP retaliated with a barrage of machine gun fire and mortar shells. Explosions lit up the night, shaking the ground and setting nearby fields ablaze. Reinforcements arrive. As the battle raged on, a small convoy of vehicles approached from the north. These weren't government troops but allies from the neighboring town of Birch Hollow. Word of Redwood Glen's stand had spread, and the people of Birch Hollow had come to aid their cause. The reinforcements brought additional firepower, more rifles, shotguns, and even a homemade flamethrower. They also brought 2 explosive-laden trucks, hastily assembled but devastatingly effective. Harold greeted the leader of the reinforcements, a grizzled man named Jack Marston. "Glad you made it," Harold said, shaking his hand. "Wouldn't miss it," Jack replied. "Let's give these bastards a fight they'll never forget." The turning point. The DLPP forces began to push into the town, using their superior numbers and heavy vehicles to breach the outer defenses. One of their tanks rolled over a barricade, its turret swiveling toward the town center. It had rolled right on top of one of the town's EMPs they had buried under the road. It was fired just in time to stop it from firing. Rachel coordinated with the explosive drone team. "Now," she shouted. A drone zipped through the air, dodging gunfire as it made its way toward the tank. It dove under the turret and detonated, sending a plume of fire and shrapnel into the air. The tank crew scrambling to escape before being picked off by marksmen. Meanwhile, Jack's reinforcements used their explosive trucks to ambush the other tanks. The trucks were lifted with off-road tires, making use of trails only known by the locals. The trucks were able to crash into the rear of the remaining tanks. Having little armor on the rear, the tanks were disabled. The units in the observation posts, equipped with night vision, moved efficiently in the darkness, ambushing the artillery unit from behind, silencing the mortars that had been raining destruction on the town. The DLPP's advance faltered. The final push. As dawn approached, the DLPP forces launched one last desperate assault. They sent waves of soldiers into the town, hoping to overwhelm the defenders. Harold and Jack led a counterattack, rallying the people to hold the line. Shotgun-wielding defenders repelled troops at close range, while marksmen picked off troops. The fiercest fighting occurred near the church, where the DLPP tried to capture the command center. Harold personally led the defense, using a combination of tactical ingenuity and sheer determination to repel the attackers. Victory. By mid-morning, the DLPP forces were in full retreat. Their vehicles were destroyed, their drones grounded, and their soldiers either captured or fleeing. Redwood Glen stood victorious, though battered and bruised. The townsfolk emerged from their shelters, cheering and embracing one another. Harold stood in the church square, bloodied and exhausted but alive. "Today, we proved that freedom is worth fighting for," he said to the gathered crowd. "But this is just the beginning. Let this be a message to every town, every city, and every person who values their liberty. Stand with us, and together, we will be unstoppable." The people of Redwood Glen raised their weapons in salute, their spirits unbroken despite the cost. The spark of rebellion had become a roaring flame, and there was no turning back. The siege of Redwood Glen would be remembered as the turning point in the fight for freedom, a testament to the courage and determination of ordinary people against extraordinary odds. The spark of a revolution. News of Redwood Glen's triumph spread like wildfire. Videos of the battle, broadcast by Rachel's team, inspired uprisings across Corvina. Towns and cities alike began to resist, using Redwood Glen's tactics as a blueprint. Victor Alvarez arrived just as the second aircraft was receiving its final graphite panel. Both the aircraft Ethan had taken were now transformed into stealth jets with an improved radar, encrypted radios, and .230 caliber guns. Victor got in, tested Rachel's encrypted radio, after getting a 5x5 from Rachel's team at the headquarters, indicating clear communication. Victor took off, using Ethan's farm field as a runway. Taking to the sky, it was time the people gained air superiority using their new stealth jet plane. Testing the newly improved radar, Victor climbed to 30,000 feet. It was a clear night, so he knew the DLPP would have their surveillance drones in the air. Within minutes, he found something on the radar, tracking its flight path and maneuvering to the rear of it, matching its speed. Victor had a clear visual of the drone and opened fire with the newly installed .30 caliber guns mounted under the stealth panels. The drone began to fall out of the sky. Victor hit the radio button to let Rachel's team know they were free, for now, from the surveillance drones. Victor would stay airborne as long as his fuel tank would allow or until he was taken out by DLPP fighter jets or surface-to-air missiles. The town of Redwood Glen, after hearing the good news about the surveillance drone, started loading everything that would be useful into their family vehicles and 3 semi-truck trailers. The whole town was evacuating, moving to Birch Hollow. When Victor was almost out of fuel, he used the radio to let Rachel's team know, who in turn told one of Victor's employees, who then took the second stealth aircraft to the sky. They would maintain a patrol as long as they could. Victor began his descent toward Birch Hollow. There he would land in a farm field near a hangar that had the rest of his airplanes. The planes were currently being outfitted with guns, explosives capable of being dropped, and radios, leaving the original body panels intact, in favor of speed and maneuverability. By hacking into DLPP logistics systems, Rachel rerouted supply convoys into ambush zones. The people intercepted these supplies, taking food, ammunition, and medical gear for themselves. Once Rachel and Samuel's teams had moved their workshop to Birch Hollow, there was a meeting with the leaders of all teams. They had to end the war soon, knowing they would soon lose their air superiority. Knowing all government employees had neural chips was a fact they would use to their advantage. They needed physical access to one of DLPP's computers, the one in the Prime Minister's office. If they could steal the hard drive, they would be able to control the neural chips in all of the government employees' heads, including the military members. A large assault would be too obvious. Max Wilcox offered to drive and Harold Rosso volunteered to accompany him in the passenger seat. Max Wilcox owned an auto parts shop and frequently delivered parts all over the city. Max took Harold and a team of mechanics to his garage where his delivery vehicle was. It was a 3D printed shell of a 1980 Porsche 911 with all black body panels. It had a naturally aspirated, liquid-cooled Porsche engine making 450 horsepower and revving to 12,000 RPM, paired with a 6-speed Subaru WRX STI transmission, giving it full-time all-wheel drive. The whole car weighed 1,500 pounds with a full tank of fuel. The car was meticulously maintained and had run flat tires. The team got to work installing 2 automatic shotguns on the roof as well as radar, night vision and thermal sensors, all controlled by in-house programmed artificial intelligence. The shotguns would be capable of defending the car from any threat, including explosive drones. Harold asked Max, "Forgive my ignorance, but isn't rear engine supposed to be a flaw?" Max chuckled, grabbed a sledgehammer and laid it on the ground. He kicked the end of the handle and the hammer spun around quickly. Max looked up from the sledgehammer and to Harold when he said, "Keeping most of the weight away from the tires that do the turning allows for less resistance to sudden changes in direction. Mid-engine may be better for circuit racing, but in the real world or rally racing, the road is unpredictable." Harold nodded. "I see. I never thought of it like that." That night, Max topped up the fuel tank and started the car to let the engine warm up. The 6-cylinder Porsche engine roared to life with ease and settled into a deep rumble. Max and Harold checked over the car, their own kit, and set off. The drive to the city was uneventful. Max knew the best route to take. It was planned with Rachel's team who were able to disrupt specific surveillance cameras. Max parked next to a supply loading bay that was close to Par Market. Max and Harold left the car, knowing it would defend itself until they returned. The Prime Minister's office was on ground level, so he would always have an easier escape in case of fire or other threat. With the help of Rachel's team disrupting the cameras, it was almost too easy for Harold and Max to get to the Prime Minister's office. A flaw of depending too heavily on technology, thought Harold. They set a charge on the window, stepped back and blew the window. The entire wall was gone. They had used maybe too much explosives, but that was better than not enough. Max and Harold rushed into the Prime Minister's office, their suppressed Benelli M4 tactical shotguns at the ready. Harold started removing the computer that was bolted to the concrete floor while Max provided security. After 30 seconds, that felt like 3 hours, they were on their way back to the car with the entire desktop computer in Harold's bag that previously held the explosives. Explosive drones started to close in on them just as they got to the car. The car's automated defense system made easy work of the drones. They jumped into the car and began speeding back toward Birch Hollow. The rooftop guns were staying busy with drones as they sped down Main Street. Multiple DLPP vehicles were in pursuit, all launching more explosive drones. Harold ripped apart the computer and threw everything out the window, except the hard drive. He suspected there was a beacon built into the computer and didn't want the DLPP to know which building in Birch Hollow the hard drive was in. Once they got out of the city and onto the mountain road, the lightweight delivery vehicle matched with a driver that had driven that car on that road on a daily basis for his entire life, left the heavy electric government vehicles in the dust. Yes, it was more top-heavy with the roof-mounted guns, but Max was able to adapt. They flew through Birch Hollow and into Max's garage where Rachel was waiting, ready to take the hard drive to the root cellar she had converted to a workshop. The final battle. Within minutes of Max and Harold returning to Birch Hollow, the DLPP had launched the entire force of the military against them. The people were ready to give Rachel enough time to use the hard drive they had stolen. All of Victor's aircraft were in the air. By flying low they would evade the DLPP's aircraft's missiles and drop explosives on the incoming army. The battle was chaotic, non-stop explosions and gunfire. Both sides were taking heavy losses. Rachel finished with the hard drive. The code was being uploaded to all DLPP neural chips. One by one, the government troops stopped fighting and fell to the ground. She had paralyzed every single one of them by using their own technology against them. As the people finished off the last of the DLPP's automated drones, a sense of relief fell over the people. They had done it. They had, against all odds, persevered and defeated the tyrannical government of Corvina. A new dawn. As the sun rose, everyone was exhausted, but there was still a lot of work to be done. They needed to unparalyze all the government employees in a safe and controlled manner. Most would continue as they had before. The only difference is that now, they would not get paid in stolen wealth. The people of Corvina had the confidence and responsibility needed to keep society working without forcing anyone to fund anything they did not want. They would fund everything voluntarily. They made a list of everything. All of the government employees did. The list was given to every person who could then decide what services they wanted to put their hard-earned wealth towards. If an arbitration court began taking payoffs from big businesses, the people would simply stop funding that company and fund a different one. An option they never had with the government court system. A business maintaining a good reputation was the only way it could stay afloat in the long term. As they unparalyzed the military members, One by one, most were offered jobs at one of the private militaries funded by the people, to protect the people, from threats both foreign and domestic. Using the latest technology, they would monitor the borders and coast. If a foreign government invaded, there would no longer be a way to get the entire population to submit to the will of the invaders. The main purpose of the militaries was as an initial response, always standing guard. No longer was the military controlled by a ruling class. It was controlled by the people, in service to the people, rather than stealing wealth from the people, because the funding was voluntary. The weapon manufacturers were free to sell to whomever they wanted. All civilians had full access to purchase whatever equipment they wanted to use to protect the people they love. When they unparalyzed the police officers, many were offered jobs in the public protection businesses. They would respond to calls from people and investigate cases of force or fraud, giving everyone accused their day in court. The insurance companies sent out a notice to all policyholders. There was no government that could simply print money to pay out policies in case the insurance company going out of business. All payments and payouts would be made in cryptocurrency or precious metals. The bureaucrats complained that a constitutional republic with democratic values would work if they did it better this time. The people knew that all the rights the Constitution claimed to protect would eventually be trampled with the stroke of a pen. Eventually the bureaucrats ran out of assets to liquidate and were forced to find employment or start businesses. Many of the game and fishery wardens continued to protect the hunting and fishing grounds. The people chose to send less of their fish to other countries. Charities were created to act as a social net for people going through hard times. This replaced community services such as welfare. This way, it was now funded through voluntary contribution, instead of stolen wealth. When a business contributed to a charity, it was now an act of virtue. Whereas before, charity was mostly a money laundering scheme. There were still violent criminals in Corvina, however. Now there wasn't a job they could get that would allow them to get away with it. The people understood that no document or procedure can turn an evil act into a good act. No longer was anybody obligated to do something they do not think is moral in the name of following the whims of the bureaucrats. Nobody was able to delegate a right that they did not have by way of voting for someone else to have the divine right to steal from everyone. A monument was built, in Redwood, Glen, to honor Ethan Harper. It is about freedom, and that belongs to all of us. Read a marble carving at the base. Mark, Ethan's son, sat on his porch years later, cleaning the .22 his father was holding at the time of his death. He had just returned from a rabbit hunting trip with Harold. He felt a deep sense of understanding. Redwood Glen had stood against tyranny and prevailed. He continued to train with his AR-15 and build up his supply of 5.56 cartridges. He felt a responsibility to protect the people he loved, and that was something he would pass on to his children. Victor Alvarez had agreed to help the private Air Force as an instructor and to develop the next generation of fighter jet. He would often do a low flyby of Redwood Glen to give them a free air show as a way of saying thank you. Everyone in the town loved it. As the sun set over the hills, it cast the town in golden light, a lasting reminder of the courage of ordinary people who stood together against oppression. If you enjoyed this story and would like more content from this channel, be sure to like and subscribe. Feedback in the comments is also appreciated.